Let's pray for a moment. Father, we again thank you for this new day and the day that some of us have already been in for a while. Just pray that you'll continue to give us your wisdom and your direction for what you want us to be doing today. And pray, Lord, that you'll just watch over our Zoom room. Please, Lord, let all the technology work well. And just help us, Lord, to, just have your wisdom to be able to do what you're calling each one of us to do within our particular locations. Thank you, Father. Just thank you for you and your Son and all that you do in our lives. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
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 Amen. Amen.
All right. Well, let's kind of take a minute. If there's any questions right now that we can answer before we get into the literature review, which we'll be working on for the next couple of weeks. I think most of you have gotten your problem, your purpose statements in, your research questions. I think we've been trying to give you comments both in the discussion room, and then I've been on the written assignments, been trying to give you some guidance there. One of the things too that I am still seeing is just some of the academic writing issues. I do remind you to look at that document. It's in the info page called 22 Tips from the Tech Reader. I do encourage you to be looking at that document as you're getting involved in writing. Okay. Well, if you've got questions along the way, go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my screen for a few minutes. Just want to kind of review a few documents that you have in the classroom, and then we'll possibly look at a PowerPoint slide to go into a little more depth on the literature review issues. So let me share here for a moment. Okay. You have this document in your on the online classroom on the info under the info page. I think there's a couple of documents there under the first word I think would be plagiarism. So I just need to make sure you look at those, because I've noticed already in some of the work there's what we call plagiarism, and let's just make sure we can define plagiarism. Plagiarism is the act of taking another person's writing, conversation, song, or even idea and passing it off as our own. This includes information from web pages, books, songs, television shows, email messages, interviews, articles, artwork, or any other medium. Even when you paraphrase or summarize or take words, phrases, etc. from another person's work, it's necessary that you give a citation, internal citation. And of course, an APA, an internal citation, is a parenthetical reference, parentheses, and I've been trying to comment to you, how to do that. We went over some of those guidelines a couple of weeks ago, but I know it'll take a while just to get accustomed to that. We really, as I've said before, we really encourage you to use the APA format so you become accustomed to that. It's important, though, even when you paraphrase something, you need to make sure you give credit, okay? Probably the most common error I've seen, sometimes people will they'll give credit, but they may give, long phrases that are actually from a source without putting quotation marks around it. And then that is considered plagiarism, okay? You have to use quotation marks when you are, using phrases. There's some phrases that are, common, the historical data indicates such and such. In other words, the historical data indicate, you're going to probably find that in a lot of different places. That wouldn't necessarily be plagiarism. But of course, when you cite the statistics, you do need to give the source. Or if you have, a phrase that a phrase that you've borrowed from a source, say it's over 10 or 12 words long, you need to generally put quotation marks around that so that your reader realizes that has come from a particular source, okay? So you need to kind of just take a look at this document. A unique phrase needs internal citation. A unique phrase is one which is coined by an author and used commonly by, and could possibly be used by other authors. Sometimes when you've used a phrase for a length of time, it maybe doesn't need a citation or a quotation mark. When people like Greenleaf, Robert Greenleaf, first started using the term servant leadership, that was possibly a unique phrase. Now, if you look up the word servant leadership, you say Google Scholar or on any of the databases, you'll find that in common use. So you probably wouldn't put quotation marks around that particular phrase any longer. But it takes a little practice getting used to the idea of making sure you're putting quotation marks. And if in doubt, I think you should do that. One issue, like it says here, is common knowledge does not need an internal citation in a paper. The problem is, and there's another document there in the info page. Let me just bring that over here a second. What is common knowledge? In this particular document, it's defined here. Information that most people would know, such as water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Information shared by a culture or a national group, such as names of famous heroes or events in a nation's history that are remembered or celebrated. Now, that becomes an issue because depending on who your audience is, a particular fact that you're just taking for granted isn't necessarily taken for granted by, say, another culture. Sometimes I will read papers and people will be giving me some facts or dates or things from their national history, but I, as an audience, may not be familiar with those at all. So it's usually best, if you're giving, a lot of historical data, it's usually best to let your reader know where that data, if that reader wants to go find more information on that particular data, it's best to have a parenthetical reference there so that readers can go and look that information up, okay? How do I determine if the information I'm using is common knowledge? Okay, who is my audience? What can I assume they already know? Will I be asked where I obtain my information? Examples, a description of symptoms of Asperger's syndrome would need to be cited for a composition in a general writing class, but probably not a citation for an audience of graduate students in psychology. A reference to the practice of fair value accounting would be understood by a group of economists or accountants, but it would not necessarily be understood by a general audience. So, the practice of fair value accounting may need to be cited so your reader can know where that kind of a phrase comes from. The best advice is, when in doubt, cite your source. And, this is common knowledge, is what this document. See, both of these documents are on the info page. I would ask you to, under the files area, I'd ask you to study these two documents a bit. And try to become familiar with it. When you are on the assignment page, when you submit your assignment, you have the option, and of course I don't look at it from a student's screen. I look at it from a faculty screen. But you should have the option when you submit an assignment there should be a button that says check for plagiarism. And if your assignment is there and you click on that button, you should be able to it should check your document. What it does, it highlights in yellow or some color if there's phrases or whole sentences that that program has found, say, on the internet. So I would encourage you to try that. That program, it's called Unicheck. It's a little difficult to use at times because when there's some technical details. Maybe we'll just need to spend some time going over that thing one time and just make sure we can all use it, because it's important to use. I guess for now, I'm stumbling here a little bit because I was using Unicheck yesterday and it's still doing some things that I don't like. For example, when you first go into Unicheck on the students on our account through Populi, it checks a document not only against the internet, but against any documents that are already internal in the Unicheck database. And the way we right now have the Populi course set up is it automatically checks your work for plagiarism. But once Unicheck checks your work for plagiarism, that document becomes a part of the internal library of Unicheck. And so what Unicheck does sometimes is checking a document against all the documents of student documents that are in its database, but unfortunately, your data, if it automatically checked it, is now part of that database, so it's checking your document against itself. I don't know if that makes sense, if you haven't ever looked at a plagiarism checker, but there's a setting on there that you can click a button that says, check this only against the internet, not against the internal library. All that to say, Unicheck is helpful, but at times it can cause some problems. And I know both Dr. Henry and I have had some issues with the program, but maybe next week, I'll just take a moment and we'll kind of go over that program a little bit and see if it can be helpful to us as we're trying to work through this plagiarism issue. Are there any immediate questions or thoughts you might have on that issue before we go forward on plagiarism, what plagiarism really is? All right. Well, hopefully it'll become more clear as either I or Dr. Henry make comments on papers or discussions. You have this document in the lesson on week 6 under the files area, which is called, this is the document I put together, and then Dr. Henry has some PowerPoints that would probably go into a little more detail that we'll look at in a few more minutes. But a literature review, which we're going to be working on, like I say, this week and next week, is the second chapter of your proposal. And it's the place where you're going to be talking about some of the significant literature that's available on your topic. Now, I realize at this point in time, you're not going to be all that familiar with, all the literature that's available on your particular topic. While you're in this class, I basically just want you to have practice doing writing in a literature review. So I think the first assignment is I ask you to develop, say, 3 topics that could be part of your literature review, and then under one of those topics, include 3 sources and try to write, a few paragraphs that would represent what a literature review might look like as you say use 3 sources. I'll just give you some practice, and then I can give you some feedback on that kind of literature review writing. But take a look at this document on week 6. I just highlighted a few issues that I think are important. A literature review is not an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography sometimes is even what you use when you've done book reviews for other classes. Let's see, make sure if you're, right now I'm hearing some noise, make sure if you're not talking that your mic is muted, just so we're not getting extra noise from various people's microphones. Anyway, an annotated bibliography is, like I say, basically a book report. You give, you look at this as the book, and here's what the author said, and you maybe analyze it a little bit, which is what you've done in a lot of your BGU classes, okay? A literature review is a little different than that. you organize a literature review not according to various sources, but you organize a literature review topically, by topics, okay? And you discuss content from various authors in a topical, interactive manner as you might do in a conversation. You show how these authors address your topic from their particular vantage point and how they may agree or disagree on how to approach an issue and how your approach may be different or similar in terms of what you're seeing in particular literature. The other issue that's important for the literature review is we try to organize a literature review in relationship to whatever the components of your theoretical framework are. And you've been dealing with that concept over the last few weeks in terms of a theoretical framework, which, like we've said, the term refers to theories, concepts, principles, and integrated models from various fields of study that are relevant to your project. And, for example, you might discuss the concept of theology of work, transformational leadership, asset-based community development, entrepreneurial business models, all these different, theoretical pieces of knowledge that will be useful as you're working on a particular problem in a particular area, okay? So the literature review is the place where you have the opportunity to discuss those concepts, those theoretical concepts that are foundational to your particular dissertation topic. A dissertation is basically, it's a few things. It's looking at literature, it's looking at theories, models of practices, models of knowledge, disciplines, and it's taking that kind of knowledge and it's applying it to a particular problem issue, for example, the kind of things that you're working with. So it's taking, it's trying to discuss that knowledge, those theories, those practices, those whatever they happen to be, and trying to apply them to the kind of work you're doing. Then, as you've done that, as you go into the empirical research part of the dissertation, you have some of those concepts in mind, and then you're trying to test that out in terms of the people that you're working with. If you are, say dealing with, I think I was just reading one of your papers yesterday on, I think it was Tim, I don't know if you're on the line right now, you're dealing with strategic planning, how that relates to organizations. You'd be talking about, say, the concept of strategic planning, and there's all different kinds of pieces of strategic planning, various theories, Theory U, which has been around for the last 10, 15 years, kind of is a type of theory that has to do with organizational strategy and planning. When we talk about even some of our transformational perspectives of leadership, those could be applied to an organization, even in terms of strategic planning. So you could talk about, say, strategic planning as a concept and talk about the literature and what people have said about strategic planning and how that concept applies to organizations. Then in the empirical research, you may be looking for certain organizations within your field of your sphere of influence or within your context that you could research and talk to leaders to get an idea in terms of how some of those practices that you've read about in literature are being applied or not applied within a particular organization. So again, the literature review is helping you understand the theoretical knowledge, and then the empirical research is usually trying to apply that knowledge or understand that knowledge within a particular area, a sample of a population where you're studying that concept and a problem that you can possibly take some principles from the literature, from practitioners, from other experts, and apply those concepts, those principles to your particular location, and then to see what kind of results begin to develop. When we talk about a transformational strategy, there again, you are looking at how people think, their perception of their situation at this moment in time. You then are understanding some principles that you've studied in literature and from others, and then you maybe start trying to find ways to apply some of those concepts and teach them, for example, within your context. You know, somebody does a seminar on transformational leadership. They're taking concepts of transformational leadership and possibly teaching them within a particular locality, and then trying to then test to see, okay, how well did my seminar, did it get across any concepts? Do I see any changes that have possibly begun to happen in people's thinking because of what I've been doing in terms of working with these people? So we got the literature review, which you're kind of getting at understanding some of the theories and principles, models that you're applying. You've got the empirical research, which you're doing, you know, your level in terms of surveys, interviews, et cetera, to begin to understand how people are perceiving the problems and possibly even how some of your theoretical principles might apply. And then you got the transformational strategy that you just kind of try out some kind of a small action-oriented application to begin to apply some of the principles that you're learning, and you'll talk about in your literature review. You begin to apply those within your particular locality through a transformational strategy. That's about the best I can do right now, I guess, in terms of trying to put those pieces together for your dissertation, and how the literature review that deals with you know, the principles, the theories, the practices that you're seeking to understand and apply to your particular situation. Any comments, thoughts on that issue before we dig into maybe a PowerPoint that Dr. Henry presented last? I see what she has that we can maybe go in a little more in depth on some issues. Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Paula.
I was looking through poverty alleviation theory, and I was checking some of the concepts, and at least the concepts in the material that I got, all of them has to do with theological sense of view there. Do I need to have a theological concept and a non-theological one? Or I was wondering if this was okay or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sometimes people, I've seen it done both ways. So we used to have a whole chapter that was devoted to the theological framework that was being applied in a particular dissertation. What we've done in the last year, we've actually taken the theology section and made it a part of the literature review because we thought it was an integral part of the theoretical framework, okay? So sometimes people, I've seen a lot of dissertations, say Dallas Theological Seminary here in the United States. They will have the students divide their literature review into the theological section, and they may have, you know, 2 or 3 topics within that major section, and then they'll have the non-theological section, and they'll have a series of topics that are part of their theoretical framework within that section. You could do it that way, or you may just have various topics. Some are specifically theological, others are from other kinds of disciplines, and you could just have various topics within your literature review and not necessarily divide it into the theology section and the non-theology section. So you've kind of got a choice, I guess, in the way you would choose to organize that. What was tell me again the category you were talking about? What was the theory you were mentioning? I didn't quite understand.
Poverty alleviation.
Oh, poverty. Yes, poverty alleviation. Right. I mean, you're going to find a lot of material, I would think. Well, I know you are. If you just say go to Google Scholar and put in poverty alleviation models, you're going to come up with thousands and thousands and thousands of sources that you'd have to wade through. If you go from a theological point of view, Arissa, Arissa is using an interesting concept. Say the concept, Arissa, that you're using, the biblical theme, we kind of gave it an abbreviation. What are you calling it?
Yeah, the theme is what is in your hands.
Right.
And I'm basing that from Exodus 4:2, when God was speaking to Moses.
Right.
But
just say briefly what that meant to you.
Yeah, actually, that voice that God spoke to me in my ministry as I was struggling to communicate from an aid-based development approach, that people were waiting for aid, for handouts, and the ministry I was serving was more of an asset-based, of what is in your hands, of use what you have already in your hands. And that paradigm shift wasn't easy for people who were used to handouts. And so the message came to me, use what's in your hands.
Right.
For people to realize God has already placed something in their hands. And so that spoke to me powerfully, and I realized how it spoke to the leaders I work with, as well as the communities.
Right. And that's really good. I mean, that's taking, say, the concept from, say, a secular point of view is called asset-based community development, right? It's looking at what a community, for example, has already that it is not necessarily being used effectively, okay? As opposed to, you're kind of contrasting asset-based community development to aid-based, right? Where in one place, you're simply giving a person a handout, or the other case, you're teaching them to become aware of what they already have and how they possibly could utilize those resources a little more effectively, right? And then you could look at that from a theological point of view, which you've just talked about. So, that particular concept, you could look at it from a theological point of view. You could look at it from a secular point of view. And then in Paula, I know you're doing the same thing in Brazil. You're looking for ways to create income-generating kinds of programs. You're dealing with poverty alleviation models. But there again, you could look at that both from some of the secular thinking on poverty. I think some of you have read the book Toxic Charity by Robert Lupkin. We have that on some of our reading lists. There's another one by Colbert and Fickert. I can't remember the exact title, but both of those books deal with this same concept.
When Helping Hurts.
Yeah, When Helping Hurts, right. Both of those books, both those models of poverty alleviation show that you can implement poverty alleviation in some ways that will actually be detrimental, right? And Arissa has said that in his work. Paula, you've seen the same thing, where you just give people handouts, but you don't teach them anything about how to really utilize resources in a more effective way, okay? So, those are models of poverty alleviation that are being studied and talked about in various contexts. And you would talk about, asset-based community development might be a title within a literature review, where if that's a model that is very applicable to your particular situation, you of course would want to include that in your literature review. Okay, but again, sometimes the lines get blurred in terms of what's a theological issue and not. I think even the fact that we've taken the whole theological aspects and integrated them into the literature review, I think we're also trying to say you can't just separate the secular from the sacred, right? That's actually faulty thinking. We need to look at everything around us from a God point of view, right? If we are really going to be God people, Christians, we aren't saying, well, now this is secular and this is sacred. No, all of life is sacred, okay? We may have thinking we use the term secular and and theological, but those are a bit artificial terms even, okay? We sometimes just use that to categorize knowledge, like I just said. Asset-based community development maybe is a term that's used in more secular circles where Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat. Okay, there's a theological point of view that we maybe want to, dissect that and try to understand that from a theological point of view. What is Paul saying? What was the context in what he was saying that? Okay.
Hey, Dr. Penny, I appreciate your response. I think my question is slightly related to the question that was asked, because when you go to Google Scholar or to the other online sources, you find lots of references, reviewed journals from the quote-unquote secular perspective. But I've been trying to look for journals from a theological perspective. I haven't found many. So I don't know if you have any guidance for alternative sources for peer-reviewed journals from a theological, quote-unquote theological perspective.
Boy, yeah, right offhand, I'm drawing a blank, but I mean, my goodness, yeah, there's a whole database. It's called, now I've lost it, but there's a whole theological database on, one's called, maybe you can help me, Dr. Henry. What's the main, one of the main theological, they just bring together all kinds of databases in the theological realm.
Okay, I'm not necessarily thinking of the theological database, which I know about, but I'm thinking in terms of finding theoretical sources that address the concept of what's in your hands, that ERISA could check in with the Christian Community Development with their website, because it's likely that you'll find material that deals with that issue, because there's a sense in which what's in your hands is similar to what Paul is doing, and that's working towards getting people to be responsible for their own economic development. That is the underlying principle there. So you want to look at that underlying principle as you go to the literature. The other thing I would want to say to everybody, and especially to both Paula and ERISA in terms of their own research, is that, as you said earlier, be careful not to try to separate out what we call the sacred and the secular. Of course, we understand and we encourage a Christian perspective on whatever you're going to study, but just be aware that a theological / Christian perspective, and that's not even accurate, because every religion has its own theology. But for example, when you look at the servant leadership literature, there is a whole set of literature on servant leadership written by Muslims from the Muslim religion perspective. So we need to be aware of that, so that when you are focusing your study, just be aware and let the reader know that you are aware that you are part of a bigger context, right? So that's very important, that you have that awareness, so that when people start to question you about your theoretical position, your interest, etc., you are able to answer from within a holistic setting, being able to articulate other positions that you may or may not agree with. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Henry. I totally agree. I don't like to disaggregate secular theological, because I know we live in a holistic world. Now, you talked about referring to the Christian Community Development website.
Yes, check their website.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of material there. I totally
Yes.
agree. My question was peer-reviewed journals.
Peer-reviewed, okay.
So that means I can quote. I have lots of material,
Yes.
books and reports and so on, but not peer-reviewed journals that I can refer to. That's my question.
Yes, I understand. And the ATLA, Association of Theological Schools.
That's the association I was trying to remember, ATLA.
Yes, I think you should check their website too, because you're likely to find references to peer-reviewed articles.
Can you say that again for me, please? Which association?
American Theological Association.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. So, okay. If there are no further questions, and I would like to move on to the presentation that I want to have us view and interact with. First of all, I want to go back to the issue of the questions, your questions of the study. Generally, you're all doing well in that area. One or two of you, I have edited questions, and I've said the questions that you have take you away from what should be your focus. So I want to review again PowerPoint that I did on developing research questions. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And there's just one slide that I want to bring to your attention. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, I really wanted to get to it. Let me see. This is going to take me. This is a long way, but I'll go this way. I'm going to get to the slide that talks about focusing and supporting questions, right? Your focusing question, and I have addressed this, but I don't think I addressed it sufficiently with you, so I want to just go over this again. The focusing question of the study is what is commonly called the major question of the study, the overarching question that you want answered as you address your situation. And it's important to be able to identify the focusing question before you get to the supporting questions. Because if you keep in mind the focusing question, you are less likely to become unfocused by bringing into the study questions that take you away from the issue that you want to address. So it's the most important question that you want to address in your study, the focusing question. Now, the supporting questions, these are the questions that will help you explore the relationship around the focusing question in greater depth. And we have examples here. The focusing question for this study was, how can the community, the university community, increase its economic impact on the Florence Muscle Shoals community? That's your focusing question or your major question of the study. Now, the supporting questions, and you will notice how they tie in to the focusing question. How does the university currently impact the community economically? What could be done that isn't being done and why? And what are the limitations? So do you see how those questions reflect that major question? And I just wanted to bring that to your attention as you continue to, or you complete chapter 1 in terms of your questions of the study. So some of you did it and in the earlier discussions, and then we seem to have drifted from it. But go back to those questions that you have. And maybe among the questions that you have, there is a focusing question, but whether it's already there or you need to identify it, identify what would be your focusing or major question of the study, and then make sure that the supporting questions are aligned with the major question of the study. And that is one way in which you will keep your focus as you go forward with the study. So I'll stop there. That is just a reminder I wanted to share with you before we go to the writing the review of literature. Questions, comments?
Can I you probably said this and maybe I just zoned out because I was writing.
Sure.
I wanted to write down the slide. And I know it's in the learning or in the portal, but what are the 3 prior activities?
Okay, let me just go back to it. Previous. No. You want to pay attention to purpose, you want to pay attention to audience and organization. But I'll put the whole thing should be in the course, the PowerPoint. If not, I'll put it in.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing any of this. And I feel like I've tried to review everything you've uploaded in.
Okay, and you're probably right. This one was probably, I think I did it in one of the presentations, but I didn't upload it. So I'm going to upload it. The whole section, the whole PowerPoint. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move out of this. Okay, chapter 2, the literature review. Some of this may be a repeat, but repetition is good. Now, the literature review is central to your study because when you do the review of literature, you are making several statements. One of the statements you are making is that you are placing your own study within a context. In other words, you are acknowledging that you are not unique in terms of your interest or the discipline that you want to study, that you are building on work that is already done. You are not reinventing the wheel. That is important. And it is important in terms also of our attitude to the study that we are doing. Because the last thing you want to do is to fool yourself to think that you're the first person studying this issue. As you've all seen, once you are able to identify your variables, your theories or keywords, and you go to the research literature, there are just zillions of people who have addressed this same issue. And sometimes you look at it and think, well, maybe there's nothing new I am going to find because so many people more gifted and more learned than I am have already addressed this issue. It is a humbling experience, but it's good. It keeps your feet on the ground. This slide presentation is in the course. It is very long. It's 47 slides, so I'm certainly not going to go through all of it. However, the reason why I chose this, they're shorter ones, is that this is thorough. it covers everything. So if you go through this, it will give you as complete knowledge as you need to have before you jump into the review of literature. Let me see, I'm going to start with a look at the first 15. I'll go through some of it quickly because some of this is information that we've already covered. It says here, the literature review discusses published information in a particular subject area and sometimes information in a particular subject area within a certain time period. And let me stop here to just repeat what we have said. It's important when you do the review of literature that you look at the most recent works. And there is a 10-year window that we recommend that you work with. Nevertheless, there are classical pieces that are much older than 10 years. If the older piece that you're looking at is a classical piece that is recognized by the research community, by the academic community, then certainly you may and you can reference it, but make sure that you look at more recent material. Now, as I say this, I recognize that within the developing world, much of the research that is done in the world is done in the Western world. There is much less research that is done on the developing world in terms of context. I am very aware of this. So one of the challenges for those of you who are doing your research in the developing world is to really search to find material from within your context. Having said that, you may find that some of the material that you find is, from our perspective, old. Nevertheless, when I look at your work, I will not dismiss that if that's the best that is out there. So then you are able then to make a case for your own study, because you would be able to say, well, this has been studied, but it was done so many years ago. The world has changed, things have changed, and you need to look at the study now in this time and context. So I just want to reference that. The literature review represents a summary of the most important information, but it is not just a synthesis or reorganization. It might give a new interpretation of old material or combine new with old interpretations, or it might trace the intellectual progression, and this is important, of the field, including major debates. For example, I think is it Tim who is doing strategic planning? Strategic planning is a concept that has progressed over the years, and I think Tim mentioned he's linking his strategic planning study to change management, and there's a lot of new literature out there today with respect to change management. So when you look at the literature, as you look at the literature, if you look at the older literature, you would want to compare it to newer literature. Are the findings the same? Are the findings different? And in a good literature review, you may want to posit reasons for similarity or differences in terms of findings. So the literature review requires you to bring to it your own critical analysis as you report on the literature. I'm going to skip that one on format. The literature review is the effective evaluation of selecting documents on a research topic. And that is why we've emphasized over and over that you need to reference the peer-reviewed literature. That is important. A review may form an essential part of the research process, or it may constitute a research project by itself. Just in passing, I do want to just let you know that it is possible to do a literature review as a culminating piece of work in a doctoral program or in a master's program. When you do that, that work has to be excellent, but it speaks to the strength of and importance of the review of the literature, because what you're basically doing when you review the literature, you are summarizing what has been done in the field, whatever field it is you're looking at. And then you are proposing, now this is what has been done, but as a result of the findings, I would like to propose that we need to go further and do X, Y, and Z. And it is in that context that just a literature review, excuse me, may be accepted as a culminating piece of work in a graduate program. That isn't a common practice, but that may be done. Okay, let me see. Why write the literature review? It provides you with a handy guide to a particular topic. If you have limited time to conduct research, the literature reviews can give you an overview or act as a stepping stone. They also provide a solid background for research papers investigation. Comprehensive knowledge of the literature of the field is essential to most research papers. Now, one of the things we do at the end of the dissertation process, when you do your defense, one of the questions that we usually ask is, we ask you to be able to identify who are the major theorists in the field that you have studied. That's important. You need to be conversant with who are the major theorists. And one of the ways in which your research can be challenged is if in your literature review you have not mentioned in any way, shape, or form the major theorists of the field. That is a no-no. I remember reviewing one person's work, and when in this case, the work was done in a certain geographical context. And I was aware that there was research that was done that, because of the limited nature of research in that area, I couldn't see anybody doing research and not recognizing or identifying that piece of research. And so I was able to say to the student, you need to find that material and incorporate it into your chapter 2, because those of us who are from that region, when we read your work and we know about this piece of research, we would wonder why or how come you have not acknowledged this research. So the literature review is really important because it says to the persons reading your work that you are familiar with the field. You know who are the major theorists, you know their work, you have read them for yourself. And this is why it's important that you read primary research. Now, it's okay to read the secondary work, but a good literature review can't be just comprised of secondary work, because secondary work is interpreted. But you go straight to the writer who has done his or her work and read that original work. Not easy reading, but as I've said, you don't try to read research literature at one sitting. You read it in sections, Okay. Why write a literature review? For professionals, they are useful reports that keep them up to date with what is current in the field. And this phrase, current in the field, is very important. That's why I mentioned to you, you look within a certain window as you report your work. For scholars, the depth and breadth of the literature review emphasizes the credibility of the writer in his or her field. So the literature review, your literature review, is reflective of your own scholarship and academic credibility. And that makes it important that you get to the literature, the salient literature. Okay. Now there's several slides on why write the literature review. I want to move down. Why write the literature review? Rationalizing the significance of the problem, enhancing and acquiring the subject vocabulary. Within every field, you have a vocabulary that is familiar to the scholars in the field. That is why it's important that you define your key terms and that you don't make up your own definitions. You use definitions that are common in whatever field you're studying, right? Because these definitions have been tested but in research, etc. So you want to show that. Understanding the structure of the subject, relating the ideas and the theories to applications, identifying methodologies and techniques that have been used, and placing the research in a historical context to show familiarity with the state-of-the-art developments. When you do your review of the literature, when you read the literature, that should be used to give you ideas about the method that you are going to use to do your study. Because, for example, if in much of your reading, you notice that the researchers have used a qualitative method to study the issue, then you want to acknowledge that. And it doesn't mean that you have to use qualitative, but you could use that as a basis for saying, therefore, I will do a qualitative study. Or you may say, well, much of the literature in the field comes from qualitative studies. And I think it's time for somebody to do a quantitative study. So I'm proposing to do a quantitative study. So what I'm showing you is that you're using your knowledge of the field to guide you in terms of your chapter 3, the method of the study, what method you're going to use. It may be that when you read the research, you see a particular research that you would like to replicate. You would like to copy that in your context, and you are free to do that. You can do that. However, when you do that, you want to acknowledge to the reader that you're going to use the same method that X used. You may be using it most likely in a different context. So if you're doing it in a different context, you may want to propose that maybe the results may be similar, maybe they may be different, but you could replicate somebody else's study, which means that you will use the same method that they have used, the same instruments, the same questions, propose the same hypothesis, etc. You can do that. That is allowed, but you have to acknowledge that that is what you've done. That's allowed. Again, just to emphasize that it is as a result of reading the literature that you will finally come to a decision as to what method you will use in your own study. So you don't just pull the method out of thin air or use a method that is convenient to you. You have to be able to place it within the context of the field, the literature. Just said, it's the purpose of the review of literature is to place each work in the context of its contribution to the understanding of the subject under review, to describe the relationship of each work to the others under consideration, to identify new ways to interpret and shed light on any gaps in previous research, to resolve conflicts among seemingly contradictory previous studies, to identify areas of prior scholarship to prevent duplication of effort, to point the way forward for further research, and to place one's original work, in the case of theses or dissertations, in the context of existing literature, as I've just said. Okay, I will skip. What should you write for your review of literature? You want to be able to, because you're doing research and you're looking at research, you definitely must be able to separate out opinion from fact. That's important, right? You must be able to identify in the literature that you're reading, what are the main variables that have been studied? What is the relationship between the concepts and the variables that have been studied? What shortcomings do you see in the findings from the study? Limitations in the methods used in the existing findings, the relevance of your own research, and suggestions for further research in the area. All of this comes out as you review the literature and report it. So you are interacting with the literature. The literature review should comprise the following elements: an overview of the subject, the issue or theory under consideration, along with the objectives of the review of literature. Of course, your objectives are grounded in your chapter 1, the purpose of the study, etc. Then the division of works under review under categories. For example, those in support of a particular position, those against, and those offering alternative theses entirely. If I were to take, for example, Paula's proposed study on income generation projects to alleviate poverty, then you would want to look at studies of income generation projects, not only within the Brazilian context, but in other developing world, other contexts. And when you look at that literature, do you see similarities? Do you see differences in terms of the approach to the study and the findings? Because that will help to guide you in developing your own focus of the study, as it were. Explanation of how each work is similar to and how it varies from the others. When you read the literature, you have to interact with it and you have to make comparisons. That is important, because it's only when you make comparisons you will be able to say whether there are similarities or there are differences. And you may want to propose why there are similarities or there are differences in the findings of the study. Okay, I'm just going to move. I'm moving a little quickly here, but as I said, the whole thing is on in this course. I'll just look at this last slide in terms of what should you write. Let me see. And there's a lot. Okay, I'll come to this one. This is a checklist that is recommended that you use after you have written. Have I fulfilled the purpose of the literature review? Is it written at a level appropriate to its audience? This is an academic paper. Are its facts correct? Is all the information included relevant? Are the layout and presentation easy on the eye? Is the language clear, concise, and academic? Does the abstract summarize the entire review? Okay, the writer refers to abstract. What I would say is that in your chapter 2, at the end of each chapter of your study, you need to have a summary statement. So it's not an abstract that you're going to have in your chapter 2. It's at the end of the chapter, you're going to have a section that summarizes the key findings from the literature review. So you're going to have a summary statement. Does the introduction adequately introduce the topic? Your introduction comes out from chapter 1 because chapter 2 is a continuation, and so you're going to restate in the chapter 2, in your review of literature, the purpose of the study that you have chosen to do, and what are the themes, the theoretical frameworks that you are going to review in order to help you to understand this issue as you move towards doing the research. Is the body organized logically? There are different ways that you organize a chapter 2. We recommend that you organize your chapter 2 topically, and those topics are the theories, etc., the major theories that will be informing your own study. Does the conclusion interpret, analyze, and evaluate? Are the recommendations reasonable? The recommendations coming out of chapter 2 would basically be recommendations that you would use to move you to the method of the study. Having looked at the literature, is there one particular methodology that you see that you should pay attention to as you design your chapter 3, the method of the study? Or maybe you might want to say, well, the studies have looked at both, have taken a qualitative and a quantitative approach. And as a result of that, you may decide, well, look, I think I will do both. I will do a study, a mixed method approach study that looks at it both qualitatively and quantitatively, okay? Have I acknowledged all sources of information through correct referencing? This is a big one. Now, and at this point, continuing from Dr. Payne's beginning comments, I really want to encourage you to start paying attention to APA. If you don't start now, you set yourself up for a lot of frustration when you complete the entire document. Now, in every chapter, when you use sources, keep before you a list of all the sources that you have used. Because remember, in APA, in your references, you only cite material that you have used. Now, it will be, because this is the beginning phrase of your research, you would not use all of the sources that you currently have before you. So we ask that at the end of your proposal, you have 2 sets of lists. The first is the references, which is, of course, a list of what you have actually used. And yes, we check. When you reference a material in the body of the paper, we go to the references section to see if that material is listed. That is why you want to keep lists. The most frustrating thing to happen to you when you write research is you quote from something and you forget it on some piece of paper and you have to search high and low to find it. You don't want to do that. So you want to keep everything together and be as organized as possible. That's important. The second list is what I call prospective references. Material that you have seen that you think you're going to use later when you develop your chapter 2 more. So you have the references, what you have actually used, and then you have a list of what you propose to use. Because for a dissertation, you should use, and here I'm speaking maybe off the cuff, but you should use a minimum of 50 sources for your completed dissertation. There is just so much out there that for you to just use 30, 35 sources, you're just scratching the surface. So I just want to encourage you to pay attention to sources that you see. It may not be, and don't be frustrated if you can't use everything in the proposal. We don't expect you to use everything, but then just keep a list so that as you go forward, you will use that later. Or you may find that you may use some of those sources that you haven't used in chapter 2 in chapter 3, the method of the study. Have I checked spelling, grammar, punctuation, and have I carefully proofread the final draft? I can't overemphasize this. You just have to do that thoroughly and well. Okay, I'll stop here for any comments or questions. The entire PowerPoint will be is already in the course, so you will have time to look it over for yourself. Questions, comments?
Dr. Henry, thank you so much. This is really helpful. This is Nerissa. Two questions. Two questions. So the minimum 50 references, does it matter how they are distributed under the different chapters of the dissertation?
No, it has nothing to do with distribution.
Okay.
Much of what you do, many of your references may be found in your chapter 3, in your chapter 2, the review of the literature. But no, we don't look at it that way.
Okay.
The references, what we look at is, of course, relevance. So you don't just reference work for the sake of referencing it. It must be relevant, etc.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether you look for these references being distributed evenly throughout the dissertation.
No.
Or if I concentrated them in chapter 2, and maybe not as much in chapter 3. So, but that's clear now.
No, that's never the way you look at it. It's always in context and relevance.
Yeah.
So you don't say, well, okay, I'll use 5 in chapter 1, 10 in chapter 2. No, that's not how it's done. It must be relevant. When you use the material, it must be relevant in terms of what you're addressing.
Right. My second question was on the grammar and plagiarism and spell check, and I know Dr. Payne referred to UniCheck. I've used that, but there's like, I don't remember the exact terms, but there's like the elementary, and then there's the advanced. So the level 1 does only some of the spell check, some of the grammar check, doesn't do everything. It highlights some of the issues it has identified, but you to go for the advanced, which is paid. So my question is, and at one point, I think I was told, or we were told, that Big EU has paid for Grammarly. So is that going to be possible to have access to the advanced spell grammar check, the full one, the advanced one? Is that going to be a possibility?
I am not aware that UniCheck does spell and grammar checks, so I'll ask Dr. Payne to address that. I'm not aware of that.
No, I don't. No, UniCheck does not. Grammarly, and we no longer have a school subscription to Grammarly. We have to UniCheck that can be used in Populi, but the school is no longer using Grammarly because they went to UniCheck. Unfortunately, you know, if you use Grammarly, you can get what you say the no fee version, which does do a lot of the grammar check. You can do a lot of grammar check with the free version of Grammarly. It just Grammarly will not do plagiarism checks with the free version. Then you have to go to the subscription-based version for Grammarly. Unicheck is specifically on the plagiarism issue. And so that's how we're using that program. And like I say, it can be used impopularly for free.
And Unicheck does your plagiarism check 100%.
It does Unicheck. It's still going to miss some things. You know, as I've run a document, say a dissertation through Unicheck, and then I've compared that with, say, what our own technical review, our own technical reader does, she is still picking up a lot of content that is not picked up by Unicheck. My wife, Roxy, she does a lot of the technical reading for the school. You can actually take a phrase or a sentence, you can enter them into Google Advanced Books, and it will then search the internet for you. It's a tedious process, but both my wife, Roxy, and then Judy Melton, both who work for the school, they both seem to have an eye for just seeing a particular few sentences, and they can automatically then tell, is this the student's own original content or not? They are just both very good at, they can see a change in style, I guess is what they see in terms of what is your own original writing, and then what is writing that you possibly copied and forgot to add the quotation marks. But yeah, Unicheck does a fairly good job of picking up a lot of the, it calls it similarity. You know, when your work, when it'll look at a paragraph and it sees sentences or phrases that are similar or exactly the same as something in an article on the internet, that's what Unicheck will pick up. And when you look at the report it generates, it will highlight that in yellow or some color.
Thanks.
I have a quick question regarding the week 6 discussion. It says, indicate some major topics you'll want to address in your literature review chapter. These topics should be directly related to your theoretical framework topics. Are you saying they're the same thing, or there's a difference between these major topics and the theoretical framework topics?
Okay, I'll answer from my perspective, and then Dr. Henry can. From my perspective, the topics in your literature review are going to be some form of a part of your theoretical framework. You know, if asset-based community development is part of your framework, you're going to have a section that's going to talk about asset-based community development. You may phrase it however you want, but you're going to deal with that content in some way so your reader understands that part of your theory that's behind your dissertation.
Okay, I said ditto to what Dr. Payne has said. In terms of your topics, one of the ways I look at it in terms of topics is look, what are the theories that are underlying your study? What are the variables? Another way to look at it is, remember, in chapter 1, you have defined your key terms. Those key terms could be used as topics to address in your review of literature. You see what I'm saying? So, any other question?
I'm sure you've said this 100 times, and I've read it over and over somewheres. But what is the ideal number of categories, subtopics, topics?
There's no ideal number of topics. We don't look at it that way. You look at it in terms of a balanced, holistic picture of the study that you're doing. Remind me of your study again, Melissa, which I should know very well.
Leadership efficacy.
Leadership efficacy, right. Now, leadership efficacy, there are some subtopics that you could think about within leadership efficacy. I think one of them that came through in the discussion was, I think, emotional intelligence. I don't know if it was you or
That's definitely TJ, but I actually referenced her study in a discussion.
sure. That is definitely a topic within leadership efficacy. Also, in terms of your context, the context in which you want to do your study, there's the issue of culture. What role does culture play in leadership efficacy? How does culture define leadership efficacy? Then, and I think you mentioned it, there is the whole area of religion. I mean, culture, we could say that religion is a subset of culture, yes, but you could you could look at religion and look to see again, what role does religion play in leadership efficacy? Is religion, is it empowering people or not in that area? And then I just use another term there, empowerment. So you start to see.
Okay, so I did actually use empowerment as one of my terms that I defined.
Sure.
But it's not emotional intelligence. That didn't even occur to me when I was writing that section that I would touch on that.
You probably should. Look and see what the literature is saying too. When you start to read the literature, you get your ideas
Come up with new terms and topics. Okay.
Yes, you definitely will from the literature.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Okay, anybody else? Dr. Payne has just made clear the sources. You should have 35 sources in the reference list of the proposal and a minimum of 50 sources in the actual dissertation. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Payne. Any other question?
I think I just want to say, as we kind of close out here, I was just looking at the assignment, and I've added a few things to the assignment. I'm always, even as I go through PowerPoints with Dr. Henry or others, I always pick up little pieces I'd like to put in. So let me just clarify. Your assignment this week, I was just reading it. Let me just stick it on the screen, and then we'll close out here in 1 minute. Okay. In week 6, you've discussed potential themes that relate to the research question, the theoretical framework. Okay, insert these themes in the appropriate subheading placeholders in the literature review, chapter 2 of the final template. So there again, you're kind of using some of these topics that are related to your theoretical framework. I suggest you just put those down as potential subheadings for your chapter. You may change the wording on those subheadings, later as you're getting into the research. But anyway, use the template. I'm trying to emphasize this with everyone. Please use the proposal template, which is on the info page, and you can then just plug these items into that template, and then you'll just upload the template for your assignment. Begin writing your literature review chapter by first providing a few paragraphs that summarize your theoretical framework as it's going to be reflected in the subheadings. As I think we've already said in the presentation, the introduction to this will be kind of discussing for your reader, just kind of giving a summary of some of the components of the theoretical framework, and then those are the topics that you're going to discuss in your literature review, and just say just in the introduction paragraph or two how those themes, the theoretical framework themes, relate to your particular topic. And then the summary of this chapter, and you'll do that in probably next week. The summary is just that. It's a summary of what are some of the main highlights or the findings that you've discovered by doing the literature review in terms of information on some of these various theories and concepts and principles that relate. But that would be a summary, a 1 or 2 paragraph summary of the literature review. So the introduction, you kind of introduce the reader to the theoretical framework components. The summary, you summarize the highlights, what were some of the findings that you discovered through the kind of literature you're working with there. Okay, I'm asking you, this week to write a paragraph or two of introduction, just give you practice on kind of helping you think through your theoretical framework, how it relates to your project. Write at least 3 subheadings, okay? And then one of those subheadings, try to develop a few paragraphs and include 3 sources, okay? Either from a book or a journal article. I'd really recommend journal articles at this point. And again, this is practice. It's practice on writing in literature review form. As opposed to a book report, you don't just say, Mary Jones wrote the book such and such, and this is what it said. Fred Smith wrote such and such, and this is what it said. That's not a literature review. That's an annotated bibliography. A literature review is, I'm dealing with asset-based community development. XYZ author has indicated that asset-based community development has been very helpful in this context, and here's why. Author Z over here says, yes, those are some components that have been very helpful, but here's some additional insights into this particular approach that we've found helpful within the context where we're working. And you'd kind of have your authors dialoguing with each other, and you're dialoguing with the authors, if that makes sense. It's a little difficult sometimes to kind of, if you're used to just kind of doing straight book reports, but try to get into this habit of trying to think topically, and then how various authors think and have contributed to that particular topic from their particular perspective, and then maybe how they agree or disagree with each other, and possibly how your approach may be similar or may be a little different in relationship to the authors that you've been reading. Okay, I can just say, just practice. This is difficult stuff if you've never done it, but just keep practicing and writing in the discussion forums, writing in your assignments. Hopefully, as you keep doing this over these weeks, some of this will start to make more and more sense, and you'll become more accustomed to the kind of writing that you need to be doing for a dissertation work. Okay, with that, we're going to need to close down. So we've got about an hour and a half. But again, the PowerPoint that Dr. Henry has just given will be in the on the lesson page, week 6. I'm tweaking the instruction sheet just a little bit with a few things I've been kind of gleaning from the PowerPoint presentation we just been there. So you might want to just make sure you've looked at that week 6 instruction sheet that's in the files area. Look at the PowerPoint slides that will be uploaded to the files area. Okay, and then the plagiarism documents that I mentioned, they should also be either in the files area of the week 6. I think they're also in the on the info page under the files area there. Sometimes I try to put them in 2 different places. If we've talked about them in a particular week, I'll put them there. But I also try to have copies of those documents over on the info page too, in case you want to go back and look at anything. With that, we need to close down. Appreciate you all being here, and we'll keep working at this next week. See how you're doing, and just thinking about questions, ideas, areas that you stumble with. Write those down, and we can talk about those more next week as we keep working on this literature review chapter. All right. With that, we're going to have to close down. Thank you again for joining us. And this has been recorded if you want to go back and listen to any particular areas.
Okay, have a good week, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.